The sky wept ash as Gabriella Turner stumbled through the scorched remains of Granite, Colorado. Every step sent pain shooting through her blistered feet, but the sound of her infant's desperate cries drove her forward. They had been traveling for days since fleeing the fire that had consumed their homestead, leaving nothing but charred memories and her husband's hastily dug grave. Her milk had dried up 2 days earlier, and little Samuel's wails grew weaker with each passing hour. "Hush now, my sweet boy," she whispered, pressing cracked lips to his forehead. Just a little longer. The main street of Granite stretched before her like a mirage. Once proud buildings stood weathered and worn, a shadow of the boomtown it had been before the silver crash of '93 sent most folks packing. 4 years later, in the autumn of 1897, it was barely hanging on, much like Gabriella herself. Her legs finally gave out in front of the general store. She crumpled to the dusty boardwalk, clutching Samuel to her chest as darkness edged her vision. Through the haze, she saw a pair of worn boots approaching, heard a deep voice cutting through her baby's cries. "Madam, can you hear me?" Gabriella forced her eyes open to find a man kneeling beside her, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His weathered face creased with concern beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "My baby," she managed to rasp. "Please, he's hungry." The stranger's gaze softened as he looked at the crying infant, then back to her hollow cheeks and desperate eyes. Without hesitation, he removed his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You'll eat tonight," he said firmly. "Both of you." Gabriella clutched at his sleeve. "I can't pay." Wasn't asking for payment. He carefully lifted her to her feet, supporting her weight with ease. "Name's Xavier Eastwood. Most folks around here call me Zav." The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was the steady beat of his heart as he carried her and Samuel to safety. When Gabriella woke, she found herself lying on a narrow bed in a small but tidy room. For one disorienting moment, panic seized her. Where was Samuel? She bolted upright, only to hear a low, soothing voice from across the room. "Your boy's right here, madam. Sleeping sound for the first time in a while, I'd wager." Xavier Eastwood sat in a rocking chair by the stove, her infant son cradled in his large hands with surprising gentleness. A small bottle was pressed to Samuel's lips, and the baby suckled eagerly. "How?" she began, her voice a dry whisper. "Goat's milk with a touch of sugar. Doc Miller's wife dropped it by when I sent word we had visitors in need." He smiled faintly. "Town's small, but folks look after their own here." "We're not your own," Gabriella said, even as gratitude washed over her in dizzying waves. "You're here now, ain't you?" He carefully rose and brought Samuel to her. "There's stew warming. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in your bones." As Gabriella took her son, their fingers brushed, and she noticed calluses on Xavier's hands, a working man's hands, strong but capable of tenderness. He moved to the stove and ladled thick stew into a bowl, the rich aroma making her stomach clench painfully. "Slow now," he cautioned as he handed her the bowl. "Been a while since you've eaten proper, I expect." The first spoonful nearly brought tears to her eyes. Venison, potatoes, carrots. Simple fare made extraordinary by hunger. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate. Xavier nodded once, then turned to tend the fire. "You want to tell me what brings a woman and baby to Granite alone, looking half dead from hunger?" Gabriella hesitated, the stew suddenly tasteless in her mouth. The memories came flooding back the farm they'd built, Thomas's bright plans, the drought that withered their crops, and finally, the fire that took everything else. "My husband died 2 weeks ago," she said quietly. "Our farm burned. I've been walking since, trying to reach my cousin in Central City. But the roads—" She trailed off, remembering the washouts that forced her onto increasingly unfamiliar paths. "Central City's near 50 miles from here," Xavier said, his brow furrowing. "You were walking that? With a babe in arms?" "I had no choice," Gabriella replied, a flash of defiance piercing her exhaustion. "What would you have done, Mr. Eastwood? Lie down and die beside my husband's grave?" To her surprise, a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No, madam. I expect I'd have done just what you did." He settled his hat on his head. Rest now. We'll figure the rest tomorrow. Where are you going? Alarm crept into her voice. Just to check on my horse. I live above the livery. He nodded toward the door that connected to another room. That there's my bedroom. You and your boy take it tonight. I'll bunk with the horses, wouldn't be the first time. Before she could protest, he was gone, leaving Gabriella alone with the first real comfort she'd known in weeks and a growing curiosity about the quiet cowboy who had saved their lives. The livery stable stood at the edge of Granite's main street, a sturdy structure built of rough-hewn timber and river rock. Xavier had converted the upstairs into living quarters years ago when he first arrived in town, with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and the skills he'd gained working cattle drives across 3 territories. Now, at 32, he found himself with unexpected guests in his humble home, a young widow and her infant son. He couldn't have left them on the street, that wasn't in his nature, but as he brushed down his dun-gelding, copper, he wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. "What do you think, old boy?" he murmured to the horse. "Ain't exactly our usual arrangement, is it?" Copper snorted and nudged Xavier's shoulder, as if in agreement. "Yeah, I know. Can't just turn 'em out, though." Truth was, something about Gabriella Turner had struck him deeply. It wasn't just her beauty, though even exhausted and trail-worn, she possessed a quiet loveliness that made his breath catch. It was the fierce determination in her eyes, the way she'd pushed herself to the very edge of endurance to save her child. That kind of courage deserved respect. The next morning, Xavier woke before dawn as usual and quietly made his way upstairs. He needed to check on his guests and then start his day's work. The livery wouldn't run itself. He found Gabriella already awake, sitting in the rocking chair with Samuel at her breast. Though the baby wasn't nursing, she'd explained her milk had dried up. She held him close, singing a soft lullaby. Xavier cleared his throat to announce his presence, and she startled slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, adjusting her dress. "I didn't hear you come in." "No need for apologies. It's your space for now." He moved to the stove and began building a fire. "How's the little one this morning?" "Better," Gabriella replied, a tentative smile warming her features. "The goat's milk seems to agree with him. He slept through most of the night, a blessing I haven't had in weeks." Xavier nodded, relief easing the tension in his shoulders. "Good, that's good." He set a kettle to boil and reached for the coffee tin. "I've got business to attend to today, but you're welcome to rest up. Doc Miller's wife said she'd stop by with more milk and some things you might need." Gabriella's spine stiffened. "Mr. Eastwood, I appreciate your kindness, but I cannot simply impose upon you indefinitely. As soon as I'm able, I intend to continue to Central City." "In what? On foot again?" Xavier shook his head. "No offense meant, Mrs. Turner, but you're in no condition to travel, and neither is your boy. The mountains are unforgiving this time of year." "I'm well aware of the dangers," she replied, a flash of that same defiance sparking in her eyes. "But I will not become a burden to a stranger, no matter how generous." Xavier studied her for a long moment, admiring her pride even as he recognized the stubbornness behind it. "Tell you what," he finally said, "the mercantile's looking for help. Owner's wife is expecting, confined to bed rest. They need someone to mind the store a few hours a day. You could earn your keep, save up for proper transport to Central City come spring." Hope and suspicion warred on Gabriella's face. "And you know this how?" "Small town," he answered with a shrug. "News travels. Besides, Hollister, that's the store owner. He mentioned it yesterday, when I went to fetch supplies for you and the boy." Gabriella bit her lip, considering. "And where would we stay in the meantime?" "Here, if you're amenable. I've got the space." Xavier gestured around the modest rooms. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." "I couldn't possibly—" "You could help with cooking and such," Xavier interrupted, suddenly uncomfortable with the formality between them. "I'm a fair hand at stew and beans, but that's about the extent of my abilities." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Are you suggesting an arrangement, Mr. Eastwood?" "I suppose I am, Mrs. Turner." He poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and handed one to her. "You need time to recover and save money. I could use a decent meal now and again. Seems practical all around." "Practical," she repeated, her eyes searching his face for any hint of ulterior motive. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood. but only until the spring thaw makes travel possible. Xavier raised his mug in a small toast. Agreed. Neither of them knew then how much would change before the spring flowers bloomed in the high mountain meadows. Word traveled fast in Granite. By midday, Gabriella had been visited by not only Martha Miller, the doctor's wife, but also Esther Hollister, the mercantile owner's pregnant spouse, who promptly offered Gabriella the position at the store. "It's perfect timing, really," Esther insisted, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "Joseph can't mind the store and look after me properly, and I'm in no condition to be on my feet all day. You'd be doing us a tremendous favor." Gabriella found herself agreeing to start the following Monday, giving her a few days to regain her strength. The arrangement included a small wage plus the ability to purchase goods at cost, a kindness that nearly brought tears to her eyes. As for her living situation with Xavier, the town seemed to accept it with surprising ease. Perhaps it was the presence of Samuel that lent propriety to their arrangement. Or perhaps the harsh realities of frontier life made practical solutions trump conventional morality. Either way, by the end of her first week in Granite, Gabriella had gained employment, a temporary home, and something she hadn't expected: friends. Xavier watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. He'd always kept to himself in town, known as reliable but reserved. The sudden influx of visitors to the livery, ostensibly to check on the poor widow and her baby, was a change to his routine, but not an unwelcome one. On Sunday evening, almost a week after Gabriella's arrival, Xavier returned to his quarters to find the small space transformed. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, a tablecloth covered the scarred wooden table, and a proper meal steamed in serving dishes he didn't even know he owned. "What's all this?" he asked, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Gabriella turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a makeshift apron. "Dinner," she replied simply. "It's nothing elaborate, but it seemed the least I could do to thank you." Xavier glanced at Samuel, who lay contentedly in a wooden crate padded with blankets that Martha Miller had brought by. "You didn't have to go to such trouble." "I wanted to." Gabriella's cheeks flushed slightly. "Besides, I promised to help with cooking, and I intend to keep my word." They ate together at the small table, the initial awkwardness giving way to comfortable conversation. Xavier found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about his days as a cowboy on the open range before settling in Granite. "What made you stop?" Gabriella asked, genuinely curious. "The driving, I mean." Xavier considered the question, absently running a finger around the rim of his coffee cup. "Got tired of never having roots, I suppose. After my parents passed, there wasn't anything tying me to one place, so I drifted. But a man gets to an age where he wants something solid beneath his feet. And the livery gives you that. It's honest work," he replied with a nod. "Horses don't lie or cheat. They're straightforward creatures. Treat 'em right, they'll do the same for you." "Like people should be," Gabriella said softly. "Like people rarely are," Xavier corrected, but without bitterness. Gabriella studied him across the table. "You're a good man, Xavier Eastwood. Not many would have done what you did for us." He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Anyone would have." "No," she replied, her voice firm. "They wouldn't have. I know that better than most." They fell silent then, the weight of her words hanging between them. Xavier wondered about her past, the hardships she must have faced before arriving in Granite, but he didn't press. Some stories needed time to unfold. As they cleared the dishes together, their hands brushed occasionally, each touch sending a jolt of awareness through Xavier that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He tried to dismiss it as nothing more than the novelty of having a woman in his space, but deep down, he knew it was something more specific to Gabriella herself. Her quiet strength, her kindness, the gentle way she cared for her son. That night, as Xavier made his bed on the floor near the stove, having insisted Gabriella keep the bedroom, he found himself lying awake, listening to the soft sounds of mother and child sleeping nearby. For the first time in years, his quarters didn't feel empty. They felt like they might someday become a home. Winter descended on Granite with a vengeance that November. Heavy snows blanketed the mountain town, transforming the muddy streets into pristine white corridors between buildings. The temperature plummeted, making the journey from the livery to the mercantile a test of endurance even for the hardiest residents. For Gabriella, those first weeks of employment were exhausting, but rewarding. Joseph Hollister proved a fair employer, and the work was straightforward, minding the store, keeping inventory, and occasionally delivering goods to those too elderly or infirm to make the journey themselves. Samuel accompanied her each day, sleeping in a basket behind the counter or charming customers with his newfound ability to smile. Each evening, she returned to Xavier's quarters to prepare dinner. Their routine developed naturally, Xavier tending to the livery's business, while Gabriella balanced her new employment with caring for Samuel. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Gabriella learned that Xavier had come west as a young man after his parents died of influenza back in Pennsylvania. He'd worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana before the expanding railroads diminished the need for such journeys. He'd purchased the livery in Granite 5 years earlier, using savings carefully hoarded during his cowboy days. In turn, she told him about growing up in Illinois, the daughter of a schoolteacher who believed in education for girls and boys alike, how she'd met Thomas Turner when he passed through her town, his dreams of a Colorado homestead so vivid and compelling that she'd agreed to marry him after just 3 months of courtship. "We were happy," she said one evening, as they sat before the stove while a blizzard raged outside. "The land was beautiful, if unforgiving. Thomas worked from sunrise to sunset to make it productive. I thought—" She paused, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I thought we had time." Xavier didn't speak, just waited for her to continue. "The fire started in the stable, dry lightning most likely. Thomas got me and Samuel out, then went back for the horses." Gabriella's voice grew distant. "The roof collapsed. By the time the neighbors arrived to help, it was too late for Thomas and too late for the farm. Everything was gone." "I'm sorry," Xavier said simply, wishing he had better words to offer. "My cousin in Central City is my only remaining family. I wrote to her before we left Illinois, but never heard back. I don't even know if she's still there." Gabriella looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "So, you see, Mr. Eastwood, your kindness truly did save our lives. Without you, I don't know what would have become of us." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "After all this time, I think you might call me by my given name." A small smile touched her lips. "Xavier," she repeated, and something in the way she said it made his chest tighten. "And you should call me Gabriella." That night marked a shift in their relationship. The formality that had characterized their early interactions melted away, replaced by a growing friendship and, Xavier admitted to himself late at night, something deeper on his part. But he was careful not to show it. Gabriella was still in mourning, still healing from her losses. The last thing she needed was the complication of his developing feelings. As December arrived, bringing the Christmas season to Granite, Xavier found himself increasingly preoccupied with ways to make the holiday special for Gabriella and Samuel. It had been years since he'd celebrated properly. There had never seemed much point when it was just him. But now, he wanted to recapture some of the joy he remembered from his childhood. The opportunity presented itself when Hank Williams, a local hunter, brought a fresh-killed deer to town. Xavier traded a month's worth of stable care for Hank's horse in exchange for the venison, planning a proper Christmas dinner. Martha Miller contributed a plum pudding, and Esther Hollister insisted that Gabriella take home a small pine tree that Joseph had cut for the store but hadn't used. On Christmas Eve, after Gabriella had put Samuel to bed, Xavier surprised her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes widening. "Just a small token," Xavier replied, suddenly embarrassed by his gesture. "For Christmas." Gabriella carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. It was a simple piece, unadorned save for a small engraved flower on its face. "It was my mother's," Xavier explained, as Gabriella stared at the necklace in wonder. "She always said it should go to someone who would treasure it." "Xavier, I can't accept this," Gabriella whispered, though her fingers traced the locket reverently. "It's too precious." "Please," he said, his voice low. "I want you to have it. For remembrance, when you eventually move on to Central City." The mention of her departure hung between them. They hadn't spoken of it since the first snow had closed the mountain passes, making travel impossible until spring. Now, with the new year approaching, The reality of her eventual departure loomed larger. Gabriella looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said simply, and turned so he could fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, and she shivered slightly at the contact. When she turned back to face him, something had changed in her expression, something Xavier couldn't quite decipher, but that made his heart race nonetheless. "I have something for you as well," she said, retrieving a package from beneath the small decorated tree. "It's not nearly as meaningful, I'm afraid." Xavier unwrapped the gift to find a finely knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "Did you make this?" he asked, running his fingers over the even stitches. Gabriella nodded. "In the evenings, after Samuel was asleep, Mrs. Miller helped me with the wool." "It's perfect," Xavier said, wrapping it around his neck. "Best gift I've had in years." They sat together before the fire, the small tree twinkling with the few ornaments they'd managed to create from paper and ribbon. Outside, snow fell softly, insulating the town in a blanket of silence. In that moment, Xavier realized he hadn't felt this content, this at home, in his entire adult life. It was a dangerous thought, because Gabriella and Samuel were temporary residents in his life, a fact he was reminded of every time Central City was mentioned. Come spring, they would leave, and his quarters would return to their previous emptiness. Only now he would know exactly what he was missing. Still, as he watched Gabriella gazing into the fire, the locket gleaming at her throat, Xavier couldn't bring himself to regret a single moment of their time together. Whatever pain might come when they parted, these memories would sustain him. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that Gabriella was wrestling with similar thoughts, her heart increasingly torn between her plans to leave and her growing attachment to the quiet, steadfast man who had saved her life and, little by little, was healing her heart. January brought renewed snowstorms and bitter cold to Granite. The town largely hibernated during these harsh weeks, with most residents venturing out only for absolute necessities. The mercantile's business slowed to a trickle, and even the livery saw fewer customers as people kept their horses stabled at home to avoid the treacherous conditions. For Gabriella and Xavier, this meant more time confined together in the small living quarters above the livery. Far from creating tension, these close quarters only deepened their connection. They established a comfortable rhythm, with Xavier often taking Samuel for hours at a time, so Gabriella could rest or handle household tasks. To her surprise, the cowboy had a natural way with children. Samuel, now nearly 7 months old, lit up whenever Xavier entered the room. The first time Samuel reached for Xavier instead of her, Gabriella felt a momentary pang of jealousy, quickly replaced by a warm glow of appreciation. Her son deserved masculine influence in his life, and Xavier provided it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. One stormy afternoon in late January, as wind howled around the eaves of the livery, Gabriella watched Xavier sitting in the rocking chair, with Samuel asleep against his broad chest. The cowboy's large hand cradled the baby's head protectively, and his usually guarded expression had softened into something that made Gabriella's heart ache with longing. "You're a natural," she remarked, setting aside the shirt she was mending. "Have you had much experience with children?" Xavier glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Not particularly. Youngest of 3 myself, and never had nieces or nephews nearby." He looked down at Samuel, gently stroking the baby's fine hair. "Guess some things just come natural when they matter." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. That night, after Samuel was asleep in his improvised crib, Gabriella and Xavier sat at the table playing cards by lamplight, a habit they had developed to pass the long winter evenings. Usually they talked easily during these games, but tonight Xavier seemed preoccupied, his responses brief and distracted. "Is something troubling you?" Gabriella finally asked, setting down her cards. Xavier hesitated, then sighed. "Got word today that Hollister's planning to close the mercantile come spring." Gabriella felt her stomach drop. "Close it? But why? The town needs a store." "He's not closing for good, just relocating to Central City. Says there's more opportunity there, especially with the baby coming." Xavier met her eyes directly. "Thought you should know, since it affects your employment." "I see." Gabriella's mind raced. Her position at the store had been her means of saving for the journey to Central City. Without it, her plans were in jeopardy. "There's something else," Xavier continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Hollister mentioned he'd be happy to have you continue working for him in Central City, if you're still set on going there." The offer should have been welcome news, a solution to her employment concerns, and a direct path to her original destination. Yet, Gabriella found herself strangely reluctant to embrace it. "That's generous of him," she said slowly. "When would they leave?" "Mid-April, weather permitting. Just 3 months away." The realization hit Gabriella with unexpected force. In 3 months, she and Samuel would leave Granite, leave Xavier. The thought created a hollow sensation in her chest that she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "I should be grateful for the opportunity," she said, more to herself than to Xavier. "It's what I've been working toward, after all." Xavier nodded once, his expression unreadable. "You'll have time to consider it." Nothing needs deciding tonight. But something had shifted between them. The comfortable ease of their evening games gave way to a new awareness, a sense of time slipping away. When they finally said goodnight, Xavier lingered a moment longer than usual before retreating to his makeshift bed near the stove. Gabriella lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm and turning over her options in her mind. The logical choice was clear. Go to Central City with the Hollisters, find her cousin if possible, build a new life there. It had been her plan since leaving the burned remains of her farm. Yet, over the past months, Granite had begun to feel like home. She had friends here, a community that had embraced her and Samuel, and then there was Xavier, whose steady presence had become the foundation upon which she was rebuilding her life. She touched the silver locket at her throat, a habit she'd developed since Christmas. What did she really know about her cousin in Central City? They hadn't corresponded in years. The woman might not welcome the arrival of a widow and child needing support. Here in Granite, she had certainty people who cared for her, who would help her find her footing again. She had Xavier, whose kindness had never wavered, whose integrity shone in everything he did. When had her feelings for him changed? Gabriella couldn't pinpoint the moment. It had happened gradually, like snow accumulating outside, each day adding another layer until the landscape was transformed. She only knew that the thought of leaving him created a pain she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. But Xavier had never indicated he wanted anything more than their current arrangement. He'd been unfailingly kind, but also careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. Perhaps he was simply a good man, doing the right thing for a widow in distress, counting the days until his home was his own again. The uncertainty kept Gabriella awake until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. By the time Samuel stirred for his morning feeding, she was no closer to a decision, only certain that the next 3 months would determine the entire course of her future. February brought a brief thaw to Granite, enough to melt some of the accumulated snow and allow residents to move about more freely. The change in weather coincided with a notable shift in the dynamic between Gabriella and Xavier. Both seemed acutely aware of the approaching spring and what it might mean for their arrangement. They continued their daily routines, Gabriella at the mercantile, Xavier at the livery, but the evenings took on a bittersweet quality, each moment together both precious and painful in its impermanence. One clear afternoon in mid-February, Xavier returned from his work to find Gabriella standing in the middle of their living quarters, Samuel on her hip, surveying the space with a pensive expression. "Something wrong?" he asked, removing his hat and coat. Gabriella startled slightly, as if caught doing something she shouldn't. "No, not at all. I was just thinking." "Dangerous pastime," Xavier remarked with a half-smile, crossing to take Samuel from her arms. The baby gurgled happily at the transfer, patting Xavier's stubbled cheek with a chubby hand. "About what, if I might ask?" Gabriella hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "About what comes next, for Samuel and me." Xavier's expression remained carefully neutral. "The Hollisters' offer, you mean?" "Yes," she nodded, moving to the stove to check on the stew simmering there. "And alternatives." "Alternatives?" Xavier echoed, bouncing Samuel gently when the baby began to fuss. "I've been wondering if perhaps Central City isn't the only option." Gabriella kept her back to him, her voice deliberately casual. Granite has become familiar, safe. Xavier felt his heartbeat quicken, but kept his tone even. It's a good town, small but decent. Joseph mentioned that Mrs. Patterson is looking to sell the boarding house, Gabriella continued, finally turning to face him. With her arthritis getting worse, she can't manage the stairs anymore. I'd heard something about that, Xavier acknowledged, wondering where this conversation was heading. I've been thinking, Gabriella said, taking a deep breath, that perhaps I could use my savings to make an offer on it. Running a boarding house would provide income and a place for Samuel and me to live. Xavier stared at her, processing her words. You're considering staying in Granite? Yes, she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. If that seems sensible. Sensible, Xavier repeated, the word inadequate for the hope blooming in his chest. I think it could be very sensible indeed. Gabriella met his eyes directly. You do? The town needs a good boarding house, he said carefully, and you've proven yourself capable of managing a business and a household both. But my savings wouldn't cover the full purchase price, Gabriella continued. I would need a loan from the bank, and as a woman alone. She trailed off, the challenges implicit in her statement. Xavier shifted Samuel to his other arm, considering. Jenkins at the bank is reasonable. With the right guarantor, he might be willing to make the arrangement. A guarantor? Gabriella's brow furrowed. Who would? I would, Xavier said simply. If you'd allow it? Gabriella's eyes widened. Xavier, that's too much to ask. If I defaulted, you'd be responsible. You won't default, he said with conviction. You're too determined for that. They stood looking at each other across the small room, the implications of this conversation hanging between them. If Gabriella stayed in Granite, if she established a business here, it would mean a permanent connection to the town and to Xavier. Why would you do that for me? Gabriella asked softly. Xavier swallowed, knowing he stood at a crossroads. He could maintain the cautious friendship they had established, or he could risk everything by admitting what had been growing in his heart these past months. Because I care what happens to you and Samuel, he said finally. Because the thought of you leaving in April has been keeping me awake nights. Because, he stopped, gathering his courage. Because I think we could build something good here, together. Gabriella's breath caught audibly. Together? If you were amenable, Xavier continued, his voice low and earnest. Not right away. I know you're still grieving Thomas, still finding your footing. But eventually, perhaps we could consider a more permanent arrangement. Are you proposing, Xavier Eastwood? Gabriella asked, her voice unsteady but her eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope. Not today, he replied honestly. Today I'm just asking you to stay in Granite, to give us time to see what might develop naturally between us, without the pressure of an imminent departure hanging over our heads. Gabriella crossed the room to stand before him, her gaze moving from his face to Samuel, who had fallen asleep against Xavier's shoulder. He loves you, she said softly. I've watched it happen, day by day. And I love him, Xavier admitted without hesitation, as if he were my own. And me? Gabriella whispered, her vulnerability plain in the question. Xavier shifted Samuel carefully, freeing one hand to touch Gabriella's cheek. From the moment you stumbled into town, something in me recognized something in you. I've been fighting it, telling myself you needed time, that your plans were set elsewhere. But if there's a chance, even a small one, that you might consider building a life here instead, I'd be a fool not to speak now. Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes, but she was smiling. I've been so afraid to acknowledge what I was feeling, she confessed. It seemed disloyal to Thomas, and presumptuous toward you. There's no disloyalty in living, Gabriella, Xavier said gently. Thomas would want you and Samuel to be safe, to be cared for, to be loved, she added, her voice barely audible. Yes, Xavier agreed. To be loved. The word hung between them, honest and unadorned. Xavier hadn't said directly that he loved her, nor had she made such a declaration to him. But the possibility of love, the seed of it already taking root, was acknowledged at last. I'll speak to Mrs. Patterson tomorrow, Gabriella said finally, and to Jenkins at the bank. Xavier nodded, relief washing through him. And I'll accompany you as your guarantor and friend. Friend, Gabriella repeated, a small smile playing at her lips. For now. For now, Xavier agreed, his heart lighter than it had been in years. That night, as they sat before the fire after putting Samuel to bed, the atmosphere between them was changed, charged with new awareness and possibility. No decisions had been finalized, no promises exchanged beyond Xavier's offer to back Gabriella's loan. Yet, both sensed they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no returning to their former, careful distance. March arrived with the first real signs of spring snowmelt, creating rivulets down the streets of Granite, early wildflowers pushing through patches of exposed earth, and longer, warmer days that hinted at the coming change of seasons. For Gabriella and Xavier, the month brought a flurry of activity. Mrs. Patterson had eagerly accepted Gabriella's offer for the boarding house, relieved to pass the business to someone she knew would maintain its reputation for cleanliness and good meals. Jenkins at the bank had initially balked at providing a loan to a widowed woman, but had relented when Xavier pledged his livery as collateral, a gesture that had left Gabriella both grateful and determined to never give him cause to regret his faith in her. The Hollisters had been disappointed to lose Gabriella's services, but understood her decision to remain in Granite. They had even offered to sell her some of the mercantile's furnishings at a reduced price when they departed for Central City beds, tables, and linens that would help establish the boarding house under her management. Throughout these arrangements, Gabriella and Xavier maintained their living situation above the livery. Though their feelings for each other had been acknowledged, they had tacitly agreed to move forward with deliberate care. Gabriella was still technically in mourning for Thomas, and both recognized the importance of establishing her independence before complicating their relationship further. Still, small changes revealed the evolution of their connection. Xavier's hand would linger on Gabriella's when passing the coffee pot at breakfast. She would straighten his collar before he left for work, her touch gentle but purposeful. In the evenings, they sat closer together before the fire, sometimes with their shoulders touching as they read or talked. These small intimacies, innocent though they were, built a foundation of trust and comfort between them. By mid-March, Gabriella had begun the process of moving her and Samuel's belongings to the boarding house. The two-story structure sat near the center of town, a well-maintained building with 6 guest rooms upstairs and comfortable public areas on the main floor. A small attached cottage provided private quarters for the proprietress, soon to be Gabriella's domain. On the day she officially took possession, Xavier helped transport her meager possessions from the livery to the boarding house. They worked together arranging furniture, hanging curtains Martha Miller had sewn as a housewarming gift, and preparing the kitchen for its new mistress. As evening fell, Xavier built a fire in the cottage's hearth, while Gabriella put Samuel to bed in the small room that would be his nursery. When she returned to the main room, she found Xavier standing by the window, looking out at the town as lamps were lit in windows up and down the street. "What are you thinking?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Xavier turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "That you've accomplished something remarkable in a very short time. 4 months ago, you arrived here half-starved and desperate. Now you're a property owner and businesswoman." Gabriella smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "Not entirely by my own doing, without your help." "You would have found another way," Xavier interrupted firmly. "You're the most determined woman I've ever met, Gabriella Turner." She laughed softly. "Perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to test that determination further." Her expression sobered. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Xavier, for everything." He shook his head. "No thanks necessary. I'm just glad you decided to stay in Granite." A silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Gabriella spoke again, her voice tentative. "It will be strange, sleeping under a different roof than you tonight." Xavier's gaze sharpened, searching her face. "Yes," he agreed. "I've grown accustomed to knowing you and Samuel are nearby." "You could visit," Gabriella offered, "for dinner whenever you like. The cottage has its own entrance, separate from the boarding house proper." "People might talk," Xavier pointed out, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly concerned by the prospect. Gabriella raised her chin slightly. "Let them. I'm a widow establishing a business, not a schoolgirl concerned with gossip." Xavier smiled at her defiance. In that case, I'd be honored to accept your dinner invitations. Good, Gabriella said decisively, because Samuel would miss you terribly otherwise. Only Samuel? Xavier asked, his voice dropping lower. Gabriella met his eyes directly. No, she admitted, not only Samuel. The honesty between them was new and exhilarating. Xavier took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the slight flush rising on her cheeks. Gabriella, he began, uncertain of what he intended to say, but needing to speak nonetheless. She saved him from fumbling for words by rising on tiptoe and pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. Thank you for helping me make a home here, she whispered. Xavier caught her hand as she began to step back, holding it against his chest where she could surely feel the rapid beating of his heart. Thank you for staying, he replied simply. They stood that way for a long moment, connected by joined hands and shared understanding. Then Xavier reluctantly released her, knowing it was time to leave before propriety was entirely abandoned. Tomorrow then? He asked. Dinner? Gabriella nodded, smiling. Tomorrow. As Xavier walked back to the livery that night, the spring air cool against his face, he reflected on the remarkable turn his life had taken since that autumn day, when a desperate woman and her hungry baby had collapsed outside the general store. He had offered them food and shelter, expecting nothing in return. What he had received instead was a second chance at happiness, at family, at love. Tomorrow would bring dinner at Gabriella's cottage, and the day after that, perhaps another meal shared. Gradually, naturally, they would build something together, something that honored her past, while embracing their future. Xavier didn't know precisely what shape that future would take, but for the first time in years, he looked forward to each new day with genuine anticipation. Back in her new cottage, Gabriella stood in the doorway of Samuel's room, watching her son sleep peacefully. She thought of Thomas, of the dreams they had shared, and the life cut tragically short. There would always be a place in her heart for her first husband, the father of her child. But as she touched the silver locket at her throat, Xavier's Christmas gift, now a constant reminder of his presence in her life, Gabriella acknowledged that her heart had expanded to include new dreams, new possibilities. Life had proven more resilient than she had imagined in those dark days after the fire, offering second chances when she least expected them. Tomorrow, Xavier would come for dinner, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each visit another stitch in the fabric of the life they were cautiously beginning to weave together. Gabriella didn't know exactly what the pattern would reveal, but for the first time since leaving the ashes of her farm, she felt truly hopeful about the future. April brought renewal to the mountain town of Granite. The last patches of snow retreated from all but the highest slopes. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the creek that ran alongside town swelled with snowmelt, its voice cheerful and constant. For Gabriella, the month marked the true beginning of her new life as proprietress of Granite's only boarding house. With the spring thaw came travelers, prospectors heading into the mountains, families relocating to mining towns further west, salesmen plying their wares along the frontier. The 6 rooms of Turner's boarding house, as she had renamed it, were regularly occupied, keeping Gabriella busy from dawn until well after dusk. Despite her demanding schedule, she maintained a ritual that had quickly become precious to both her and Xavier: dinner together in her cottage 3 evenings each week. On these nights after Samuel was asleep in his crib, and the boarding house guests settled for the evening, they would share a meal and conversation in the privacy of her small sitting room. As April progressed toward May, these evenings together grew increasingly intimate, not physically, for both still maintained careful boundaries in that regard, but emotionally. They spoke of childhoods, of dreams abandoned and new ones taking shape, of fears and hopes for the future. With each conversation, the bond between them deepened, evolving beyond friendship into something neither had quite dared name aloud. On the last Friday in April, exactly 6 months since Gabriella had stumbled into Granite, Xavier arrived for dinner carrying a small bunch of wildflowers and a wooden toy horse he had carved for Samuel. The baby, now nearly a year old, had recently taken his first tentative steps and greeted Xavier at the door with outstretched arms and joyful babbling. "There's my boy," Xavier said warmly, swinging Samuel up for a hug before presenting the carved horse. "Look what I brought you." Samuel immediately put the toy to his mouth, making Xavier laugh. "Everything's for tasting at this age, I suppose." "Everything," Gabriella agreed, accepting the wildflowers with a smile. "These are beautiful, Xavier." "Thank you. Just something I gathered on the ride back from William's ranch," he said modestly. "Nothing fancy. I love them nonetheless." Gabriella placed the flowers in a mason jar with water and set them on the small dining table, already laid for their meal. "You're earlier than expected. I hope you don't mind waiting a bit for dinner." "Not at all," Xavier replied, settling onto the floor with Samuel to demonstrate the proper way to play with the horse. "Gives me time with this little wrangler." Gabriella watched them together, her heart full. Over the past 6 months, Xavier had become more than just Samuel's benefactor. He had become a father figure to the boy, patient and loving in ways that made Gabriella's chest ache with both gratitude and longing. As she returned to the kitchen to finish preparing their meal, she reflected on how completely Xavier had integrated himself into their lives. He was no longer just a visitor who came for dinner. He was the person Samuel reached for when hurt or tired, the man Gabriella found herself thinking of throughout each day, wondering what might make him smile or what stories he might share that evening. When dinner was ready, a simple but hearty beef stew with fresh-baked bread, they settled at the table together, Samuel in a high chair Xavier had crafted for him. The baby babbled happily as he gummed pieces of soft bread, occasionally offering soggy morsels to the adults with generous, if messy, enthusiasm. "He has your generous spirit," Xavier observed, pretending to eat a piece of bread Samuel thrust toward him. "And your stubborn determination," Gabriella countered with a laugh. "Once he decides to do something, wild horses couldn't stop him." Xavier grinned, not bothering to deny the accusation. "Sounds like a fine combination to me." After dinner, and once Samuel was settled for the night, they sat together on the small sofa before the fireplace. The evening had turned cool, and Xavier had built a modest fire to ward off the chill. They sat closer than propriety might strictly allow, but in the privacy of the cottage, such concerns seemed increasingly irrelevant. "I received a letter from the Hollisters today," Gabriella said, breaking a comfortable silence. "They've settled well in Central City." Xavier nodded. "Good to hear. Joseph was worried about the move being hard on Esther, especially with the baby coming so soon. She's delivered already a healthy girl they've named Rebecca." Gabriella hesitated, then added, "She also mentioned my cousin Martha." Xavier turned slightly to face her better. "Your cousin? The one you were trying to reach when you arrived here?" "Yes." Gabriella twisted her hands in her lap. "It seems Martha left Central City 2 years ago, after marrying a banker from Denver. The Hollisters learned this from the neighbors." "I see," Xavier said carefully. "Does that change anything for you?" Gabriella looked up at him, her expression serious. "It confirms what I already knew in my heart, that my place is here in Granite now. My cousin was never more than a vague possibility, a desperate hope when I had nowhere else to turn." She took a deep breath. "But now I have a home, a business. I have friends who care for Samuel and me." "You have more than friends," Xavier said quietly. "Yes," Gabriella acknowledged, her voice equally soft. "I do." Xavier reached for her hand, his rough, work-hardened fingers engulfing her smaller ones. "Gabriella, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Having you and Samuel here, becoming part of your lives, it's given me something I never thought I'd have." "What's that?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "A family," Xavier said simply. "Or the beginnings of one, at least." Gabriella's breath caught as he shifted on the sofa, not releasing her hand, but turning to face her more fully. "I've been careful not to press you," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "You needed time to establish yourself here, to find your independence after everything you lost. And I respect you too much to rush what's growing between us." "Xavier," Gabriella began, but he gently squeezed her hand. "Please, let me finish while I have the courage," he said, with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I'm not a man of many words typically, and I want to say this right." Gabriella nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I love you, Gabriella Turner," Xavier said, the declaration straightforward and unadorned, like the man himself. I love Samuel as if he were my own son, and if you'll have me, I'd like to make us a proper family. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the firelight and scattered it in tiny rainbows. It was my grandmother's, Xavier explained, holding the ring between them. I've had it in safekeeping all these years, never thinking I'd have cause to offer it to anyone. But from the moment you and Samuel came into my life, everything changed. Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Xavier Eastwood, she said, her voice trembling slightly, are you asking me to marry you? I am, he confirmed, his own eyes suspiciously bright. With all my heart. Gabriella looked at the ring, then at the face of the man who had saved her life, given her shelter, supported her independence, and gradually, carefully, won her love. The answer was as clear as the mountain streams running full with spring melt. Yes, she said simply, joy flooding through her. Yes, I will marry you. Xavier's face broke into a smile of such radiance that Gabriella felt momentarily breathless. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along, and then, with infinite gentleness, cupped her face in his hands. May I? He whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Gabriella closed the distance between them, pressing her mouth to his in their first kiss. It was tentative at first, then deepening as years of solitude and months of growing affection found expression at last. When they finally parted, both were flushed and breathing unevenly. I've wanted to do that since February at least, Xavier admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Gabriella laughed softly. Only February? I've been thinking about it since Christmas. Xavier pulled her closer, and she went willingly into his embrace, resting her head against his chest, where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. They sat that way for a long while, watching the fire and speaking occasionally of practical matters when they might marry, whether Xavier would move into the cottage or Gabriella and Samuel into the quarters above the livery, how the town would receive the news. People have been expecting this announcement for months, Xavier said wryly. Martha Miller asked me just last week when I was going to make an honest woman of you. Gabriella snorted inelegantly. As if I haven't been entirely honest in my intentions toward you, Xavier Eastwood. Have you now? He teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. And what intentions were those? To make you fall utterly in love with me and my son, Gabriella replied without hesitation. To create a family from the ashes of what I lost. To build something beautiful and lasting here in Granite. Xavier's expression sobered at her words. You've succeeded on all counts, he said softly. I am utterly in love with you both. As the fire burned low, they reluctantly acknowledged that the evening must end. Though they were now engaged, propriety dictated that Xavier return to his quarters until they were properly married. He kissed her once more at the door, a lingering promise of the life they would soon share. Sleep well, my love, he murmured against her hair. Dream of our future. I will, Gabriella promised, her hand still caught in his, though the reality promises to be even better than any dream. As Xavier walked back to the livery, his step light despite the late hour, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in just 6 months. From solitary livery owner to soon-to-be husband and father, it was a change he would never have sought, but now couldn't imagine living without. He remembered that first day, seeing Gabriella collapsed on the boardwalk, her baby crying with hunger. You'll eat tonight, he had promised them. Both of you. A simple promise, fulfilled with a bowl of stew and a bottle of goat's milk. Yet from that small act of kindness had grown a bond that would last a lifetime, proof that even in the harsh realities of the frontier, love could take root and flourish. The wedding of Xavier Eastwood and Gabriella Turner took place on the first Saturday in June, with the mountains wearing their finest spring greenery and the town of Granite turned out in full celebration. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, with Samuel toddling down the aisle ahead of his mother, clutching his wooden horse in one hand and a fistful of wildflower petals in the other. Gabriella wore a dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, with money saved from the boarding house's first profitable months. Xavier stood tall and proud in a new suit, his usually weathered face smooth-shaven and solemn until the moment Gabriella appeared in the church doorway. Then his expression transformed into one of such naked joy and love that several of the female guests dabbed discreetly at their eyes. The Reverend Thornton kept the service brief but meaningful, acknowledging both the memory of Thomas Turner and the new family being formed today. When Xavier and Gabriella exchanged their vows, their voices rang clear and certain, promises made with full hearts and clear eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared, and a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople as Xavier gathered Gabriella into his arms for their first kiss as a married couple. The celebration continued at Turner's boarding house, where tables had been set up in the garden behind the main building. Martha Miller and several other women had prepared a feast, while Joseph Hollister, back from Central City specifically for the wedding, provided barrels of beer and bottles of wine. Music, laughter, and congratulations filled the air as the town celebrated not just a marriage but a story of resilience and hope that had unfolded before their eyes. As the festivities continued into the evening, Xavier found a moment to pull Gabriella away from the crowd, leading her to a quiet corner of the garden where flowering bushes provided a semblance of privacy. "Happy, Mrs. Eastwood?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Gabriella smiled up at him, her face luminous in the golden light of late afternoon. "Happier than I ever imagined possible again," she confessed. "And you, Mr. Eastwood?" "I have everything I could ever want right here," Xavier replied, glancing across the garden to where Samuel was being bounced on Hank Williams' knee, shrieking with delight. "A beautiful wife, a fine son, a community that feels like family." Gabriella followed his gaze, her expression softening. "When I think of how close we came to never meeting, if I had taken a different road out of the mountains, if you hadn't been at the Mercantile that day." "But you did, and I was," Xavier said simply. "And here we are." "Here we are," Gabriella echoed, leaning against him contentedly. "Together." As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the garden, Xavier and Gabriella rejoined their guests for the final dances of the evening. Samuel, exhausted from the excitement, had been put to bed in the cottage, looked after by young Emily Patterson, who had eagerly accepted the role of nursemaid for the occasion. The boarding house's guests had been temporarily relocated to other accommodations throughout town to provide privacy for the newlyweds' first night together. When the last guest had departed with final congratulations and perhaps a knowing wink or two, Xavier and Gabriella stood alone in the cottage that would now be their shared home. "Well, Mrs. Eastwood," Xavier said softly, taking her hands in his. "Here we are, at last." Gabriella looked up at the man who had saved her life, who had become first her protector, then her friend, and now her husband. In his eyes she saw the same mixture of desire and tenderness that she felt in her own heart, a love built slowly and surely on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. "Here we are," she agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him with newfound boldness. "And here we'll stay." In the years that followed, the story of Xavier and Gabriella Eastwood became something of a legend in Granite, how a starving widow and her baby had been saved by the town's quiet livery owner, how kindness had blossomed into love, how a family had been forged from tragedy and hope. Turner's boarding house thrived under Gabriella's management, gaining a reputation throughout Colorado territory for its clean rooms and excellent meals. Xavier expanded the livery to include a small horse breeding operation, his keen eye for quality stock attracting buyers from as far away as California. Samuel grew into a strong, confident boy who adored his adoptive father and was later joined by two siblings twins, Eleanor and Thomas, born exactly 2 years after their parents' wedding day. The Eastwood children became known throughout Granite for their intelligence, good manners, and the distinctive blue-gray eyes they had inherited from their father. On quiet evenings, when the boarding house guests were settled and the children asleep, Xavier and Gabriella often sat together on the porch of their cottage, watching the stars emerge above the mountains that had brought them together. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of Thomas Turner and the farm that had burned, of Xavier's years of solitude before their paths crossed. More often, they discussed the present and future of the children's education, improvements to their businesses, dreams for the years ahead. And always, without fail, They expressed gratitude for that fateful day when hunger and desperation had led Gabriella to Granite, and kindness had prompted Xavier to say those simple words that changed everything. "You'll eat tonight, both of you." From that promise, fulfilled with a bowl of stew and a bottle of milk, had grown a love that sustained them through all the joys and challenges of frontier life. A love that had transformed two wounded souls into a family. A love that proved, beyond any doubt, that even in the harshest landscapes, the human heart could find its way home.